Open your Bibles to chapter 32 of Job. It's my sincere desire that we will move through these 6 chapters from 32 to 37 and into chapter 38 tonight. Last time, I forgot to really check. I think we started, we've kind of been going verse by verse for a while, and then did a big swath after we went through the ash heap trio, we're calling them, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, sitting there with Job on the ash heap and giving Job their perspective on his predicament. After they had gone through the first round, their views on things and frankly, their criticisms of Job is what it amounts to, and Job responding. After that, because there's so much repetition in this, I think it was chapter 19, we started in last time, the week before communion, and went through chapter 31. And I'm going to do something similar to that, although this is a very different situation that we get into here tonight with this man Elihu. We haven't seen him yet. We've seen Job sitting on the ash heap in deep trouble. And I think we know this, but let's be reminded. Here's a man who was well known. He was blessed by God. 10 children. The inference is that his children are probably adult children, so I'm presuming they were also married, or at least some of them maybe married. He had so much. He had wealth. He had, his family. We look in chapter 1 at all the flocks that he had and all of this. And then we see the scene in heaven as Satan brings the challenge to God. And so God permits Satan to strike Job's family, to strike his wealth, his real estate, all of that. And of course, his famous remark at the end of chapter 1, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And then as we come into chapter 2, again the scene in heaven, and Satan basically saying to God that, Job is just a mercenary, and, the only reason he loves you, the only reason he worships you, and this is a good thing for each one of us to think about. Why do we worship him? Why do we say we love him? Is because you treat him so well. And he says, if you strike his body, skin for skin, he says, you touch his body, he'll curse you to your face. And by the way, that was not just a remark in chapter 2. That's a challenge that Satan has laid out against God and against Job, and it carries through this whole book. That's what Satan is desiring to get Job to do. And so in using his friends, he's seeking to do that. Whether his friends know that or not, I presume they don't, but that's his desire. There's always something going on behind the scenes, and we don't really think of those things very often in terms of our own lives. When we think of Satan, we think of, shivers down our spines, demonic, booey-wooey kind of stuff, but the reality is he's subtle. The first adjective that's ever used of him in the Bible in Genesis chapter 3 is that he was subtle, crafty. Paul says that he appears as an angel of light. He masquerades as an angel of light. So in many ways that he operates behind the scenes even in our own lives. And so anyhow, all that said, skin for skin, touch his body, and he'll curse you to your face. And the Lord permits him to do that. Of course, we see him now with boils all over his body, running sores, worms, and maggots throughout all those sores. It's hard to describe just how bad and putrid was his situation. Probably sat there for at least a month. It seems that, one of the passages we saw suggested that it's been months, however many that plural is, that he's been there. His friends, remember, there's no texting, there's no emailing, but they know him, and they've come from many miles. They probably came from anywhere from 50 to hundreds of miles away by camel to come to him. So however long it took for the word to get to these guys and their friends, and they come, they spend 7 days sitting with him, probably sitting Sheva, I would say, and then they speak. Miserable comforters are you all, Job says to them. And a lot of lessons I think the Lord has had for us in this. So we've gone through all of this, and we've gone through Job's 6-chapter response. We ended at chapter 31, and we come up with a man tonight, the mystery man, a man named Elihu. El, God, my, who, he. So you got to kind of think about this in Hebrew because everything's backwards. But he is my God, basically, is what Elihu means. And he's the one who's going to speak. He's young. He even makes the point that I've held off talking because, you guys are older. In fact, at one point he says, you're very old. It's like, back off, man. But a very interesting character. We'll look at some of that as we get into it. So scholars are definitely divided about him. Okay. And by the way, he's the only one, we'll see in a moment, he's the only one who has a genealogy. Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar. We know that, one's from Tema, one's from descendant of Shua, that kind of thing. But we really don't have a genealogy, but Elihu does. Very interesting man. So we'll get into more of that in a minute. So these three men, we're going to go kind of verse by verse for the first part of this, and then we'll jump through this. Verse 1. So these three men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Now, I won't do this to you all the time, but probably all of our translations say that. He was righteous. They stopped speaking because they saw Job as righteous in his own eyes. So we read that, and you can probably come to your own conclusions about that. But we might be wrong. And I say that because, and I know I've mentioned this before, the Septuagint version, which is not a Bible that probably any of us really read, but it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew text in the 3rd century before Christ. This is very ancient Hebrew that this has been written in. It's very different. First of all, it's poetry, but it's Hebrew poetry and very ancient Hebrew poetry. So it's difficult to translate, more difficult than most of the Old Testament. And so the guys who would have been the most expert would have been those closer to it back in the 3rd century before Christ. They don't translate it as his eyes. They translate it as their eyes. In other words, they stopped answering Job or speaking with Job because they saw him as righteous in their eyes. In other words, they had no more to say. When I say righteous, don't think perfect, don't think sinless. That's not the idea. It's just that there was nothing else to say to him because they couldn't stump him. Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself, meaning Job. He justified himself rather than God. In other words, he was saying that God's unfair. Also, against his three friends, his wrath was aroused because they had found no answer, and yet they had condemned Job. Now, because they were years older than Elihu, Elihu waited to speak to Job. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, his wrath was aroused. So we read 4 times that his anger was aroused. It doesn't mean he had an anger problem. He's got some issues with these guys, and we'll look at that. So first of all, let's just kind of work through a couple of the technical points here. It says that he was a Buzite. So if you remember, maybe you do, in Genesis 22, we read that Abraham's brother, Nahor, we have a list of his sons, 2 of them, Uz and Buz. Okay, it's hard to forget these guys, okay? Uz and Buz, which would mean Isaac was their cuz, okay? I'm just saying. Look, it's there. You can't leave it alone, so, okay. Uz and Buz. So that doesn't mean he's necessarily a descendant of Buz. I mean, you could say someone was a Danite, from Dan, from the area of Dan. Doesn't mean they're from the tribe of Dan, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that. But it also says that he was from the family of Ram, which is interesting if you think back to Ruth chapter 4. There's a genealogy there. The ancestors of David and Ram is in there. So it's possible that Elihu is one of the ancestors of King David. I'm not trying to be dogmatic about that, but it may well be something like that. I've got a few notes. I want to make sure I hit some of these things before we go on. Here's a guy who's, he definitely comes on strong. He's courteous in many ways. He certainly starts out that way. He's sensitive to Job's situation. but he also doesn't have a problem with being sarcastic and harsh as it pertains especially to the ash heap trio, the three comforters. And the other thing is, Elihu doesn't speak from his personal experience. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, they all speak from experience, the idea of the wisdom of old age. That's even among ourselves. We have a tendency to think that, the longer you live, the more wisdom you have. Not necessarily true. It's the idea you can have 40 years of experience walking with the Lord, or you could have 41-year experiences of walking with the Lord and never go beyond that, right? There are some like that, not you, I'm sure, but you certainly see that as you're a Christian. Anyhow, so here's a guy, he's going to have the longest discourse of all the commentators, right? Of the three and himself. He has a 6-chapter discourse. So Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered, and he said, I'm young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid, and I dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, age should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men are not always wise. Here we go. He's saying, you guys have been around a long time. It doesn't mean you're necessarily wise. Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. So his patience is exhausted, and he's going to get some things off of his chest here. By the way, let's also cover this, because some of you, if you've read through Job before, we can all come to different conclusions about Elihu. Some people, depending upon the commentators that you read, some people will say, well, look, he's young. He's got this cocksure arrogance, he comes on that way. That's one way of looking at it. Some people would say that he's just repeating the same arguments as the other guys have, which I don't think he's doing. Some people would say that Elihu is a Christophany, an appearance of Christ in the Old Testament. Some people would say he's a type of Christ. I don't happen to think any of those things are true, but people have those opinions, and you can have your own. But he is different. He's very different from the others. In fact, let me say this. When we get to chapter 42, God is going to say to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, you need Job to pray for you or I'll kill you. But he doesn't include Elihu in that. So he stands alone, all right? So let's not maximize who he is. Let's not make him something that he's not. But at the same time, let's not minimize it. And he's basically saying that where he's coming from, the things that he has to say, are not coming from his personal experience, but as God has revealed it to him. Revelation has been given to him. And I don't think that we should be cynical about that. I think there's reason to believe that. He says, therefore, based upon all this, I say, listen to me. I'll also declare my opinion. Indeed, I waited for your words. I listened for your reasonings. I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words. You haven't answered Job's questions. You haven't solved his problem. Lest you say, we've found wisdom. God will vanquish him and not man. Now, he's not directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words. They're dismayed and answer no more. Words escape them. It goes on. Verse 17. This is where he's going to get some things off of his chest before he gets into things with Job. I also will answer my part. I too will declare my opinion, for I'm full of words. He's not saying he's full of hot air like the other guys were. They were kind of accusing one another of being bags of wind. But he's not saying that. He's saying, I'm full of words. The spirit within me compels me. By the way, especially if you have New King James or King James, the translators are trying to be sensitive that when a pronoun like he or him, is used, and it appears to be referring to God, then they'll capitalize the H, But in this case, like spirit, they'll capitalize the S if we're talking about the Holy Spirit. But but because the translators are not clear on how to handle it, they'll use the S or in a lowercase sense. Some of you are like, who cares? Well, it's important in terms of what's he referring to. Is he just saying my spirit feels this way? Or is he saying God has directed my spirit, or the Spirit of God within me? Now, it doesn't take much easy to say. It doesn't take much sophistication as a Christian to understand that the Spirit of God indwells the Christian, but that was not the standard, certainly in Israel, nor was it the standard before Israel. And yet there are people we can think of, upon whom the Spirit of God dwelt, right? He appears to be one. I want to be careful again about being too dogmatic about that. And that's why I think he's a mystery man. There are things here, and mystery's okay, right? We don't always have to nail everything down, but it's good. It's good to be left with some mystery, to realize that God does some things that are way beyond our understanding. That certainly comes true as we study this book. He says, so I'll answer on my part. I too will declare my opinion, for I'm full of words. The Spirit within me compels me. Indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It's ready to burst like new wineskins. Like, I got to speak. I've got to finally say something, because you guys have been prattling on for however long it's been now. I will speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer, because the Spirit is compelling me. Let me not, I pray, show partiality to anyone, nor let me flatter any man, for I do not know how to flatter. And now he says, chapter 33, and that's good he doesn't know how to flatter. There's a lot of that goes on in the church. It's good that doesn't happen here. So, but please, Job, now he focuses on Job. He's dealt with the other guys. But please, Job, hear my speech. Listen to my words. My words come, verse 3, from an upright heart. My lips utter pure knowledge. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. If you can answer me, set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Truly, I'm as your spokesman before God. I also have been formed, just like you, in other words. I've been formed from the clay, just like you have. Surely no fear of me will terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy on you. So his words, he's saying, are going to be honest. They're going to be impartial, humble heart. He says, surely, you've spoken in my hearing. I've heard the sound of your words. I've heard the sound of your words saying, I'm pure. Without transgression, I'm innocent. There's no iniquity in me. And yet he finds occasions against me. This is what Job is being quoted as saying, that I have no transgressions, I'm pure, and yet God has found occasion against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He's watching all my paths. So here's problem number one, is that he's referring to all of Job's comments up until this point, and Job's belief at this point. Remember, early on, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And he had the opinion, I don't mean this cynically against any of us, don't misunderstand. But you see how easily we said amen to that. It's another thing to go through the gritty grind of deep sorrow and pain, bodily, his skin is open, oozing, worms are his clothing, he says, and to continue to have that opinion as his friends are assaulting him. Okay? It's not so easy to say, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. I'm not saying it's not true anymore, but he's come to the point, remember who's behind the scenes here. Satan's desire, Satan's plan, his strategy is to get Job to accuse God of wrongdoing, right? And Job's saying, God has mistreated me. That's problem number one that Elihu is going to address. And that God has dealt with him in I'll use the word capricious way. This whole idea of being capricious. I feel like doing it this way. I feel like doing it that way. To say that God does that. By the way, that's not true. That's not God. That's Allah, by the way. That's exactly who Allah is. Great, mysterious Allah. He does whatever he wants to. That's not Jehovah God. Okay? But in a sense, that's what the accusation is becoming. And Elihu is standing there trying to buttress against that to keep him from going there. Are you with me? You understand? Now, I realize people have different opinions about Elihu. So that doesn't mean I'm right on everything, but that's the way I interpret it, and that's what you get. All right, so he says, look, Elihu says, look, in this, you are not righteous. In this, you're not righteous. I'll answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? For he doesn't give an accounting of any of his words. And Paul will say in chapter 9, I'll just read it to you, but in Romans chapter 9, indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing that's been formed say to the one who formed it, why have you made me like this? Doesn't the potter have the power or have the right over the clay, that from the same lump of clay to make a vessel of honor as well as a vessel of dishonor? Well, it sounds great in terms of a theological discussion, unless you're going to personalize it and to say, you mean God can make me, in effect, a spittoon or a toilet and someone else a beautiful vase? Yes. That's what he's saying. He's not capricious. He has that right because there's an overarching plan, which Paul develops later in that, and I'm not doing tonight. But so Elihu is saying, God's greater than man. His plan is higher, so why contend with him? He doesn't have to give an accounting for his works. He doesn't have to give an accounting. You can't bring him to court, the fairness court, which is what we always want to do. Let's face it, we do that. This isn't fair. This isn't right. Now, if I could speak to God, like we've all said that. When I get to heaven, I want to know. No, you won't. For God may speak in one way, he may speak in another, yet man does not perceive it. We would modernize that to say the problem of unanswered prayer, right? Why doesn't he respond some way? Well, he always responds. And it's not just yes, no, or later, but his style is entirely different. He may answer a prayer through circumstances, and we wouldn't even realize it for years until it happens. Again, I can't drill down into all these things, but it's important that we keep that in mind. He says, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls upon men slumbering on their beds, then he opens the ears of men. He seals their instruction in order to turn man from his deed and to conceal pride from man. He keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. Now think about this here. What Bible did these guys have? And I'm just going to nominally say 4,000 years ago. I'm going to say roughly the time of Abraham, which is 2,000 years before Christ. What Bible did they have? They didn't. So what did they have then? Well, they certainly had basic revelation. All of creation is revelation. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 1, that there's not one person on planet Earth who is innocent, and there's no one who can say, I have no evidence that there's a God. There's testimony of God to every single person. Everybody talks about the guy on the island. The guy on the island, in many cases, has a much better understanding that there's a God than people in our own nation, right? But so they had that, of course. They had dreams. They had visions. People talk about dreams and visions a lot nowadays, especially depending upon what side of the church you may be in. People will talk about that, or sometimes, people have their different prophecies that they come up with that they found in a dream. It could be a pepperoni prophecy, but there's a lot of different ways those things happen. And why does God do it? He says to instruct, to break pride in a man, ultimately to keep us from the pit, destruction. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and with strong pain in many of his bones. I had meant to use this quote weeks ago, but if you ever had a chance to read C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain, it's a worthwhile book to read. One of the famous quotes, there's a lot of great quotes of Lewis, that God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our consciences, but he shouts to us in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. True. All right, so verse 23. If there's a messenger for him, here he gets into something that Job has talked about earlier. If there's a messenger for him, a mediator, one among 1,000, to show man his uprightness. Then he's gracious to him, and he says, deliver him from going down to the pit, for I found a ransom. The word there is kafar, we would say, an atonement, right? These are interesting words when you remember who's speaking, what time in biblical history they're speaking. The idea of a covering for sin. Kafar means to cover, like a blood atonement. It's kafar. And so that's what he's speaking of. Now here's Elihu. He's focused on this idea of a mediator, just as Job was, by the way. There have been a number of mentions so far. In chapter 9, Job cried out that if only there was a daysman, or we would say an umpire, someone to mediate between me and God. In chapter 16, he said, even now I behold my witnesses in heaven, for he vouches for me is on high. Chapter 19, we looked at this last time, a famous quote. He says, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and that I shall stand at the latter day upon the earth, he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. I mean, think about what he's saying 2,000 years before Christ. Easily 500 to 600 years before Sinai. You know, the revelation that's here. God is speaking, and we'll get into this more in chapter 38, but how does God reveal these things? How has God revealed this idea of that there is a mediator, that there is one who intercedes between man and God? Now, we could go a lot of different places with that, but I know I've mentioned this a number of times in the past. I don't get into it often, but in the days long before the flood, we read in Genesis chapter 1, is it verse 4? God set the stars, the lights, the great light, the lesser lights in the heaven, and I love it. And he also made the stars. And he says there, for what purpose? For signs and for seasons. And we kind of just read over that. There's a lot that's said in that little sentence. And one of the things that becomes obvious is that there's a word that gets transliterated. It doesn't get translated in your Bibles. In chapter 38, Mazzaroth, MazzerOth. And in that is the idea of the constellations, that many of which are now considered in the pagan idea of the zodiac, but was actually a gospel story that went throughout the year, from Virgo through Leo, the lion, from the Virgin to the lion. Even some of those constellations were used as the standards that were on the banners of the tribes of Israel as they moved through the wilderness. Pretty strange stuff. Some of you think that's weird. That's okay. Read it for yourself. But The Gospel and the Stars is a book that was written by Joseph Seiss. Bullinger also wrote a similar book to it. So technical reading, but it's worthwhile if you're into that. Anyhow, so how did they know? Well, that's one of the ways. That's one of the ways. That already at that time, God had been promising that there would be one who would come and who would defeat the power of sin. In fact, even Orion, most of us probably know the constellation Orion. You can see it during these months. We know him by the 3 stars, on his belt. But the constellation itself, he's a warrior, and his foot, one of his feet, is crushing a serpent. It's a beautiful picture of Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, all in the gospel and the stars. Okay, I don't want to derail this too far. We've got room to go here. Okay, he says, verse 28, he'll redeem his soul from going down to the pit, and his life shall see the light. Behold, God works all these things twice, in fact, 3 times with a man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Give ear, Job, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. I want to help you through this. I want to see you justified here. If not, listen to me. Then hold your peace, and I'll teach you wisdom. And at this point, Job's silent, has nothing to say. And now Elihu goes on. Hear my words, you wise men, give ear. The ear tests words as the palate tastes food. It goes on. Let me pick up in. Okay, verse 10. Therefore, listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness. In other words, what's Job's near accusation here? That I'm being mistreated. My situation is not justifiable. I don't understand the situation that I'm in. And so I'm being mistreated. Far be it from God to do wickedness, or from the Almighty, for the Almighty to commit iniquity. For he repays man according to his work. He makes man to find a reward according to his way. Surely God will never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty pervert justice. He's going to say that God is sovereign over all these things. But who gave him charge over the earth? Who appointed him over the whole world? Obviously, he's the one. No one put God there. God has always been there. If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, and all flesh would perish together, and man would turn to dust. What would happen if God just decided to remove breath? Like, yeah, it's been long enough, no more breath. We take it all for granted. We take it all for granted. Just everything that holds us together. When we get into 2 Peter chapter 3, at one point with a great roar, everything will disappear, Peter say, will burn, right? The idea is that which holds all things together was Jesus Christ, right? He will just let go. And the binding force that holds all atoms, all compounds, everything together, gone. All he has to do is that. Who appointed him? He wasn't appointed. He's always been there. And if he decided to pull it away, all flesh would perish. And he's going to say, God's an impartial ruler. If you have understanding, hear this. Listen to the sound of my words. He's not, verse 19, he's not partial to princes. God doesn't regard the rich more than the poor. They're all the work of his hands. Paul says, who are you, O man, to judge another man's servant? In other words, it's so easy for us to look at another one and to judge them and think that God is doing something. Who are you to judge another man's servant? We all stand before the Lord on our own. Beginning in verse 21, he's going to say, God's omniscient. He's the omniscient judge. For his eyes are on the ways of man. He sees all of man's steps. There's no darkness. There's no shadow of death where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. No one can hide from God, in other words. Verse 24, he breaks in pieces mighty men without inquiry. He sets others in their place. Right? I mean, Psalm 139. It's so much in Psalm 139. But he knows every single one of our thoughts before they even arise in our consciousness. I have such an impoverished understanding of God. And I know I'm in good company. I mean, we're seeking to walk with the Lord. I believe that for all of you. But at the same time, we have such an impoverished understanding of him because we were made in his image, but we continue to make him in our own. Right? And, I mean, when we start to look at those things, verse 25, therefore he knows their works. He overthrows them in the night. They're crushed. Chapter 35. No, a few verses. I said we're going to move through quickly, just like we did with some of these others. I want you to go back and read these things on your own. But my point is, because I'm skipping, Elihu's arguments are not just, 140 character tweets. They're not just a little idea here and a little idea there. They're all fabricated together. And I know people have different opinions about who he is and what his motives are. But my view of Elihu is that he's accurate and he's spirit-directed here. By the way, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, it'd be very difficult, I believe, to find inaccuracies in the things they've said. But there's no heart, there's no compassion, right? There's no love in the things they've said. And they see God in a brutal in a brutal way. But their words are not necessarily inaccurate, just like much of what comes out of many people's mouths in the church. So, but Elihu does appear to be, I want to be careful, but he does appear to be, in most cases, spirit-directed. And while he's seeking to show compassion and kindness to Job, he does come on very strong about some things, and it's not wrong what he's doing. So he says, chapter 35, verse 4, I'll answer you and your companions with you. Look to the heavens and see, and behold the clouds. They're higher than you. If you sin, what do you accomplish against God? Or if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to God? If you're righteous, what do you give God? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness affects a man such as you, and your righteousness affects a son of man. But in other words, but it doesn't affect God. And God is not lessened in any way by our sins. All right, let's move chapter 36. And he proceeded. He says, verse 2, bear with me a little. I'll show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. I'll fetch my knowledge from afar. In other words, it's not coming from me. That's what he's saying. I'll ascribe righteousness to my Maker, for truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. And that sounds kind of pompous. But the idea that the word tamim is what he's using. He's complete. He has good knowledge, complete knowledge from God. He's not saying he knows all things. That's not what he's saying. But he's speaking by the means of the Spirit of God. He said, behold, God is mighty, but despises no one. He's mighty in strength of understanding. He doesn't preserve the life of the wicked, but he gives justice to the oppressed. I like this, and it's important we look at it, I think, beginning down in verse 22, talking about the glory of God. This is a topic we just don't talk about enough. And many times the idea that we have in terms of the glory of God is, again, something other than. Behold, God is exalted by his power. Who teaches like him? Who has assigned him his way? Or who has said, you've done wrong? So God is beyond man's instruction. Remember, this is good instruction for each of us. Remember to magnify his work of which men have sung. Yeah, I like that Psalm 34:3. Magnify the Lord. Let us magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. There's an idea right there. I mean, that's something that we could talk about for a day together. The idea that who we are and who God is, our lives, and we all fail in this, but our lives should magnify the Lord. When we talk about God, we should be magnifying the Lord. What we do instead is we magnify ourselves. We justify ourselves to ourselves. We justify ourselves to one another. We try to show that we're actually something very often other than we really are. We're not magnifying God. We're magnifying people, right? Again, it's related to we're created in his image, but now we've made him into our image, and we're saying, just take the rumble seat for a bit and let me take the road, okay? So remember to magnify his work of which men have sung. Everyone has seen it. Man looks on it from afar. Behold, God is great, and yet, or you would say, God is great, but we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered. He's beyond our understanding. Now, he gets into something that he'll get into a whole lot more of this when we get into chapter 8, but here's one. For he draws up drops of water which distill as rain from the mist, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. Now you knew that, right? Right? You know that. That's not a trick question. You know that, right? The hydrologic cycle. Now, again, let's stipulate that this is being spoken 4,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, Solomon observed, right? That the rivers all flow to the oceans, but the oceans never overflow, right? He understood that there's something happening here, but what is it? Now, that's a Dylan song. You know something's happening, but you don't know what it is. Do you, Mr. Jones? Anyhow, but he observed that. But here's the deal. It was only 400 years ago that the hydrologic cycle began to be understood by man. So here's Elihu saying this 4,000 years ago, this idea that water evaporates, it goes up into the clouds, and then it comes down as rain. This is breathtaking to understand that that was understood. And I don't think it was just Elihu. I think there's evidence in Scripture that more than that. But yeah, the guy's name is Bernard Palissy, was the one who first to document the hydrologic cycle. Some of you don't care. But anyhow, indeed, can anyone understand the spreading of clouds? In other words, where do the clouds come from? Does anybody understand the thunder from his canopy? Look, he scatters his light upon it. He covers the depths of the sea. For by these he judges the peoples, and he gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with lightning. He commands it to strike. The thunder declares it. The cattle also concerning the rising storm. Now, there's a hint that this is where, in chapter 38, the Lord speaks out of the whirlwind. So it's the suggestion by many people, could be, that this is where a storm is beginning to arise. So anyhow, that's sort of the drama behind the scene, I guess. But at this, chapter 37, at this my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Hear attentively the thunder of his voice, the rumbling, right? Often in Scripture, thunder is considered God's voice by the ancient Hebrews. In poetry, Hebrew poetry, thunder is considered God speaking. Hear attentively, and don't just think that was quaint, what did they know? But it could be just a poetic device, but it's used often. Hear attentively the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He sends it forth from the whole heaven. He sends his lightning to the ends of the earth. Verse 5, he thunders marvelously with his voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. For he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength. Verse 9, from the chamber of the south comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds of the north. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Also with moisture, he saturates the thick clouds. Verse 19, teach us. What should we say to him? Right? He's saying this to Job. Teach us. Tell us. And to the other guys, tell us. What should we say to God? For we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. Should he be told that I wish to speak? If a man were to speak, surely he'd be swallowed up, right? You think you're actually just going to get into the throne room of heaven and say, hey, by the way, I got my number's here. I got a deli number. And no, you think that's going to happen. You'd be swallowed up. Even now, men cannot look at the light when it's bright in the skies. You see, just go out and look at the sun. You can't stand and look at the sun. How are you going to stand before God? Who's brighter than the sun? Who made the sun? As for the Almighty, verse 23, we cannot find him. He's excellent in power and judgment and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Therefore, men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart. Praise the Lord. Here we are. Now, we read this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. He's going to ask. People have different opinions on how to count it up. The highest number, some people range from 60 to 70 to 77. Doesn't matter, I think, how many questions. But he's going to ask all these questions. And they're going to fall into three categories. Creation is one of those categories. Another is God's providential care over, I'd say, all of nature. Is restraint of the forces of evil in the world. Those are the three basic categories. Now I'm just going to touch some of it before we end here tonight. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, and he said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now, some people think that he's speaking of the three guys, which would make some sense, right? But actually, let me just, in chapter 42, Job takes it to himself. In chapter 42, Job answered the Lord. He said, I know you can do everything. No purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand. So God's speaking about Job. Who is this who darkens counsel with words without understanding? Therefore, I've uttered what I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me which I didn't know. Listen, please, let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now look at that. But now my eyes see you. Play that in the video in your mind. Now my eyes, I've heard of you, but now my eyes see you. By the way, the divine name, Jehovah, was used early on, the early chapters. Then it was all Elohim, it was all God. And now Jehovah speaks out of the whirlwind. Who is this who darkens counsel with words without knowledge? Prepare yourself like a man. Buckle up, cupcake. I will question you, and you will answer me. Let's dive right in. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? I mean, really, I remember years ago, and I forget who was elected, but I remember there was a particular teenager in a church we used to be a part of, and she was very upset about the person who'd been elected president, and how does God do this, and all. And I remember just going to this here and say, read the chapter. God's saying, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? We think we can just accuse God of all these. He is absolutely sovereign over all things, or he isn't God. You've got a choice. Which is he going to be for you? And so, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. By the way, all of these you can drill down into big areas of study. Who determined its measurements? Who determined the measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fashioned? Like who fastened? Who hung the earth where it is? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together. I mean, he's talking about the fabric of space, the nature of matter, and space-time, all these things. He's diving into all these. We can take it as simplistic or as complex as you want to get here. But that's what God is talking about when he speaks to Job. And by the way, that's to us too. Because we each have our areas where we'd like to shake a finger sometimes. We know we shouldn't, but we still end up with a fist. You can bring the finger back, but there's still a fist going. Where were you when I laid the foundations? What do you know about space-time? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I mean, again, big areas, this whole idea of sons of God. We see that in Genesis chapter 6. We see it in first chapter, second chapter of Job, sons of God. It's used again in the New Testament, in John chapter 1, Luke chapter 20. In one case, it deals with angels, when the morning stars and the sons of God sang for joy. Those are the angels. They're direct creations of God. When Jesus uses the phrase, John chapter 1, he came to his own, but his own received him not. But to all who received him, to all who believe in his name, he gave the right to be called sons of God. Right? A direct creation. When you're born again, you become a direct creation of God. Not an angel. Not that yet. Who shut the sea? Who shut in the sea with doors? I love this one. This is a very interesting one. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? What's he referring to? The flood. I mean, what happens at the flood? We think 40 days, 40 nights. That's a lot of rain. I mean, if you look at the atmosphere today, there's not enough water in the atmosphere to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. We can get into the whole discussion from Genesis about, the firmament, the water canopy that was around the earth so that it could rain for 40 days and 40 nights. But that's not what destroyed everything on earth. It was when the fountains of the deep burst forth. When the crust of the earth, and imagine water under all that pressure shooting forth. The whole topography of planet Earth changed. What we envision as Earth today and what it looks like today, mountains, all these things today, and what was prior to the flood, completely different. But he's asking, who shut the sea in with doors when it burst forth, issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. I don't care what John Kerry says, God says, the water's not going any further. So you can buy your beachfront property. It's okay. Don't believe him. By the way, it says over here, real quick, in Psalm 104, you who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Don't think that they stood above the Himalayas. That the mountains, they had not become so high yet, okay? The mountains stood above, the water stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they fled. At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. You've set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. This all precludes, by the way, another global flood. God said that, right? Genesis chapter 9, never again will I destroy the earth with a flood, right? He set his bow in the clouds as a sign of the covenant that he's made with all of the earth and all creation, including mankind. He'll never destroy the earth again with a flood. He didn't say he wouldn't use fire, right? He didn't say that. He said the flood. And people argue, I hope you don't, but this idea of a global flood. There are many people who say a global flood. I mean, that's what an idea. Seriously, a global flood? No. If the Bible is true in any way, it must have been a local flood. Well, okay. Just if you want to work through the logic of that for a moment, for the Christian, work through the logic of that. First of all, the whole geologic strata of the earth, the whole fossil, the stratification of fossils. You know, we've been taught in high school that it's random from, simple forms to complex forms, all mixed up in there. Bogus. Absolutely bogus. Or rather, they go from simple to complex. Now it's bogus. They're all mixed together. It's evidence of the flood. And just a little bit of Bible logic, if it was a local flood, if in fact it was a local flood, God said he would never do it again. There have been thousands of local floods, so God's a liar then. So you have to decide what you're going to do with the biblical text and do a little bit of scientific work. By the way, a great movie. I thought I'd seen it, and I had never seen it. Renee and I just saw it less than a week ago, called Is Genesis History? If you've never watched it, rent it. You can get it on Amazon Prime. It's so much worth your while. Is Genesis History? You'll love it. And you'll thank me. Anyhow, no, I don't care about that. But anyhow, okay. We can do a little bit here. And so for the next 4 chapters, God's going to ask about all of the present processes on planet Earth. Animals, the sea, all these things. Have you commanded the morning since your days began? Have you caused the dawn to know its place, so that it might take hold of the ends of the earth and the wicked be shaken out of it? By the way, we all love to watch the sunrise, probably. It's cool to watch the sunrise. Have you ever watched it day by day and maybe kind of measured where the sun comes up? We all know the sun comes up in the east, right? But it comes up in a different place in the east every single day. It has to. God said it that way as it moves along, as the sun moves along the ecliptic, relative to us, as it moves along the ecliptic. So it's always coming up in a different place. He's saying, did you do that? What do you know about that? I said it that way. It takes on form like the clay under a seal. It stands out like a garment. From the wicked, their light is withheld, and the upraised arms were. Have you entered, this gets interesting, have you entered the springs of the sea? I mean, the secrets of the deep are still largely undiscovered. I mean, when you think of the Marianas Trench, and there's, what is that, 5.5, 6 miles down? I mean, that's just breathtaking. I don't know how to even comprehend that much water. And it's one thing to try to comprehend, the Himalayas, something pushing 29, 30,000 feet high, but then the same amount or more deep. And yet volcanic activity continuing in that trench to move the tectonic plates outward. This is amazing stuff. And it all just happens. It just evolved. Anyhow. Because, the basic assumption of science, in fact, most people have it, the paradigm that we live with is uniformitarianism. Everything just, in fact, Peter talks about it in 2 Peter 3, that in the last days, we're seeing it now. People are going to say, well, where's the promise of his coming? Everything continues just as it has since the days of the fathers, right? Uniformitarianism. Everything is always the same. And yet, all you have to do is look around. You can look at planet Earth, but go, I don't know if it's clear tonight or what, but take binoculars and go, you can, naked eye, you can do it a little bit, but it's better with binoculars. Take a look at the moon. It's been through a rough go. Have you ever looked at it? Really serious. Or any of the planets, for that matter. Really pockmarked. Catastrophism is an important principle that we really don't pay much attention to. We think of gradualism all the time, but catastrophism is what changes things. In fact, we fear catastrophism. We fear the big one that's going to come, big ones that are going to come, the New Madrid fault, or on the West Coast, these kinds of things. We fear that, but that's a natural part of planet Earth, and yet it's not by chance. God holds it. He has control over all of it. Have you entered the springs of the sea? Have you walked in search of the depth? Have the gates of death, there's an area that no one really understands. Science sure doesn't. Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Like, we have these weird ideas, and I'm just going to say, any of these after-death experiences you hear about, take them with a grain of salt, please. It doesn't matter how compelling some of the books are and how cute the little kid may be and all that, but be careful. Read the Bible instead. Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Now, that's one area that science seems to have a better understanding of compared to all these other questions. At least now, since we've gotten out into space, we have pretty good measurement of the breadth of planet Earth, or however you want to measure the radius of it. Tell me if you know all these things. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Wow. We're going to end on this one because we got to end. I love this stuff. I'm so excited to finally get to this area of Job. This is like the kicker area. Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Like, where does it come from? What is light? A guy like John Doherty can do a whole lot more in talking about light than I'm ever going to do. But what is light? Energy. Matter. It moves in a wave, and yet it responds to gravity. It's very interesting. We say, well, what is darkness? What do we say? Absence of light, right? Have you ever studied a black hole? It's that the density is so great that it even draws the light back into it. And how can that be if there's light? Okay. Start to work through the logic. It's amazing. We live with these simplified little ideas, and one of the things, I don't even understand how this works, but some of the more recent experiments, I guess in the last 20 years or so, is the idea that all photons that exist are connected to one another in such a way that if one photon is affected in one area of the universe, every photon knows it. I don't understand that. That's the stuff I read about it. What is light? Where's the dwelling? Where's the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where's its place? So that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the path to its home. Do you know it because you were born then? Or because the number of your days is great? I'll leave on this one. They're great. Have you entered the treasury of snow? Or, and this one gets me, have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle, and for war. I mean, really, go back tonight and read Joshua 10, the battle of Beth Horon. 75-pound hailstones and God's remarkable marksmanship that only the enemies are killed. I mean, you got Israelites and the Canaanites all mixed together, and only the Canaanites are hit. God's pretty good marksman, you know? But there's so much more to it. By what way is light diffused? We'll come back to that. But by what way is light diffused, or is the east wind scattered over the earth? Probably most of us never really consider about this. There's a lot you could do with that, but he connected light, coming from the sun, we'll say, with the wind. We say, the meteorologists, they just never get it right. Well, no one really understands it, except that without the sun, what weather would there be? Everything that happens with the weather, all the winds, everything that happens is based upon the sun. It's all connected. That's a very easy way to say it. Not that I understand it. But God's asking these simple questions with complex tentacles. And Job's going to say, okay, I give. And God's going to say, no, buckle it a little tighter. I got some more questions for you, Job. None of us understand these things. We really don't.